Africans on the continent and in the diaspora are celebrating Africa Day today, and this is also a moment to reflect on how regions or how the region is perceived elsewhere. Africa was historically viewed as a dark continent and is still viewed that way in some parts of the world. It makes you wonder if it ever was. So who sets this narrative? Who tells the story of the continent and why? We're now joined by Shellgan Peterson, a journalist from Namibia, and Eugene Davis, a journalist from Ghana. Thank you very much to both our guests and for joining us. Perhaps just let's start with a brief introduction for our viewers in terms of the kind of stories that you cover, or your beat, essentially. Shellgan, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you for your time. So if you can introduce yourself to our viewers and tell us the kind of stories you cover.
Good afternoon. I'm a journalist with a Namibian newspaper here in Namibia. Essentially, I cover an array of political stories, also health. I mean, if it's a national emergency like we had COVID, I cover that. Mostly governance issues, and just working on developmental issues as well, or stories that speak to where Namibia currently is and where it needs to go and where its focuses are.
Sure. From Southern Africa to West Africa, Eugene Davis, a good afternoon to you. Please introduce yourself to our viewers and tell us the kind of stories you cover.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning here in Ghana. My name is Eugene Davis. I'm a business journalist and a parliamentary correspondent with Business 24 and Investment Times digital newspaper. So mostly my newspaper is big on business news, so I cover here in Parliament the budget, the loan agreement, and other national issues as well. And essentially, I also cover issues on climate change, the environment as well.
Sure.
That's basically what.
Okay. Let's get into the narrative of the continent. I think when we were growing up and still dreaming of becoming journalists, you'd hear oftentimes the tagline of a dark continent being given or pushed about the continent. What is the narrative of 2023? Shellgan, let's start with you.
I think what we've seen is more content from Africa going to the world directly from home. You no longer see, if you want to read a story about, for instance, Namibia, South Africa, you won't see that a lot being done by international media houses. And I think that's where the problem started of a dark nation. If you take stories of how we would do it back in our countries and how an international journalist was essentially do the story. It's narratives that is obviously built up by them, but not understanding the context in which it is. When we see stories about, now in Namibia, we are doing this green hydrogen we have these green hydrogen prospects. And you see in the international media sort of just praising, this new idea. But we also see Namibian journalists now coming to the forefront, looking at past capital projects in a similar industry, really breaking down the laws and looking at the groundwork and really setting the narrative for themselves. And I think we definitely have to thank the internet for that, because now people can hear African stories from Africans, where we look at what a Southern African city looks like. It's not that, just dust in the air. There's actually vibrant life in every part of Africa. And I think, that's where the difference comes in today, is where you can see Africa, from an African perspective, written by an African journalist.
Sure, and not children with flies on their heads or their noses. Eugene, when we talk about the economy of the continent, a lot is still said in 2023 about nations on this continent being underdeveloped nations or still emerging nations 60 years since the formation of the Organization of African Unity. And so from the work that you do, when you take a look at monies and how they are spent, what is the narrative there?
Thank you very much. First of all, what we need to also averse our minds to is that the media have a critical role to play in aiding good governance, transparency, and accountability accountability. And we owe it to our community or the broader society to tell important and informative story. And here, what I mean by that, looking at the economy over the years, I want to even narrow it down to just the post-COVID era and this Russian-Ukraine war. You realize that Africa has more or less been dependent on donor countries, for want of a better word. And a case in point, Ghana, just 2 days ago, the IMF document that was reviewed indicated that we've kind of mortgaged our resources for default of a loan because we owe in excess of close to 1.3 billion over the last decade. So if you look at our heavy dependence on it and with the Western media rather picking on such stories, you realize that probably it's going to affect our narrative here. And in that breath, I feel we, the local journalists here, really have to rather focus on the creatives, the innovative side of things here in Africa. Projecting people who are doing things in the area of STEM, people who are doing things in the area of technology and all that. Because when you focus on just the bad stories, it affects all of us. Because narratives do matter a lot. It affects investment, it affects the youth, it affects opportunities everywhere.
Yeah, see, because that's also part of the argument, Shellgan, that journalists on the continent need to focus on good stories and don't just tell bad stories, which is an okay of an argument. However, how easy has it been for you, for instance, to get hold of the main role players, be it from the African Union, be it a president from South Africa, for instance, you just next door in Namibia? How easy is it for you to pick up the line and call a president from Tanzania and get the story directly from the source?
We actually have a running joke in our industry amongst the colleagues that if there's any SADC event in Windhoek, that is your opportunity, and that might just be your only opportunity to get a hold of these officials, on the continent. What we've seen is they have, to some extent, there is some liking towards Namibia. We've seen this with the African Union chairperson of the commission. Whenever he's in Namibia, he's quite free to speak to the media and do interviews. But once they leave Namibia, that's the last time you can see or you can get hold of any of them. The most recent that I think getting a hold of your president is quite interesting. I think the spokesperson of your president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has been quite effective as well, but not a lot of countries. We don't see that with Angola. With Botswana, it's only when you have a good relationship. So a lot of the presidents, I think, outside of SADC, you will never get a hold of them unless you have a direct link to someone in his office or to a journalist who can assist with a number. But access to information overall in Africa, it's very limited. When you go to even to the SADC events and you truly want to understand what the resolutions are, and where it's coming from, have a discussion with the people on the ground. There's just not a good relationship and a political will for people to truly understand when we have regional blocks and how what their mandates are, what are the bounds and the limits of their work. So when people do speak about the African Union, when people do speak about SADC, it's a different understanding of what their limits and their bounds are. Understanding, for instance, in Namibia, we sort of have a quota crisis within the African Union. We can take about 25 more people that can be employed there, but because of the lack of access to information, we haven't filled our quota at the African Union. We just barely filled our quota at SADC. So in terms of that, access to information as a whole is just a problem. But coming back to your question in terms of, the conversation around the good and the bad stories, the reality is that what the media right now in Africa is doing is that we are actively shaping our laws and our policies. We are digging into loopholes to bring out what needs to be changed, because in a democracy grows and policies and frameworks and the justice systems, they all change with time. And that's what the media is doing. Of course, there will be good stories. I mean, just recently, there was a brilliant article in Namibia did about this guy who makes, for instance, bricks with sand and plastic. I mean, we already have the plastic issue in the world. And those are stories that uplift the nation, to really assist. And then you have stories where we are currently digging into our public procurement system and laws. And we've seen numerous stories come out in the last year. And I think there needs to be a fine balance. But I mean, we are shaping a democracy, and that's very important right now.
Okay, Eugene, let's give you the last word in terms of how to make people understand. A nation like Ghana, for instance, which was amongst the first to gain independence, we now understand that in 2023 it runs the risk of losing some pieces of the country and its natural resources because it is unable to meet its debt obligations.
Precisely so. Just as I said earlier, it's unfortunate, but I think it will also come down to our leadership. Probably we could say our leadership hasn't done enough as expected of them, and the media too would say haven't really stepped up to the plate by way of trying to keep them on their toes. Because you ask yourself that over the years, the monies that they've borrowed, rarely, you can't point to things that maybe the money that were borrowed have been used for. So that is when the media would have to come in to hit the government hard, criticize them, write features, do stories with the people on the street to get them to take the government to task. That no, you went to borrow from China, you went to borrow from IMF. Where are the resources? And I remember there was a time in Ghana and the media focused on abandoned projects, let's say the hospitals in the countryside, because this government, a new government will come, the government will abandon an already existing project because he wants to do his own legacy. You start a new project and maybe you lose the next election, the other government will come, will not continue. So that means that you leave fields of abandoned projects sitting there at the expense of the state. And now, as part of the IMF deal, they are also asking government to increase utility bills. And these are some of the things I feel the media would have to focus on. Getting
Thank you so much, and I do apologize for disturbing your thought there, but a big thank you to our journalist friends from Namibia Shellgan Peterson and Eugene Davis, a journalist from Ghana, and thank you for the work that you guys